So let me put a few up here and then we can maybe give this a little bit more context and talk about them. The first picture looking under the box there that says tradition and narratives is Alasdair MacIntyre. MacIntyre is a really formative figure for anyone working in ecclesial ethics. And, MacIntyre in his book After Virtue and other books after that kind of brought out this way of thinking about the history of Western thought and the location that we're in now. And what MacIntyre said is that the location we're in now is that, we talk about ethics, we talk about right and wrong, we talk about what is good or what is just. But in general, we have completely lost the references, the historical references for what those terms could even possibly mean. Because we are so distant from the originary figures of people like Aristotle and people like Augustine and Aquinas. We're so distant from them and from their cultural location after the Enlightenment, after modernity, that we're really talking about something completely different. And that's why we're so fractured. MacIntyre also says that fracturing is really not something that can be overcome through better proofs or better reasoning or something like that. In fact, that fracturing, the inhabiting of particular and unique traditions, is just part of the human experience, and it's something we need to come to terms with. Now, MacIntyre does say that we can compare traditions and say there are some aspects of one tradition or another that lead to human flourishing more fruitfully than others. But he's at the same time does say you really can't escape tradition. You always have to go back to a tradition. And what we need to do for MacIntyre, what we need to do is go back to the tradition of Aristotle and virtue ethics and really focus on that. So MacIntyre, very important figure. The one in the middle is John Milbank. Milbank is an Anglican theologian, an Anglo-Catholic theologian. Milbank was one of my doctoral examiners, which was rather intimidating. But he's a decent guy and very difficult to read. But Milbank is writing in this tradition, and like MacIntyre, and Milbank draws very much on MacIntyre. Milbank is tracing out a historical narrative, which you might call a historical genealogy. Now, MacIntyre's is really focusing on Kant and the Enlightenment and kind of the loss of the perceptual moral world that originally supported virtue ethics. Milbank, and our text talks about this a little bit, it might be a little bit hard to pick up on, but Milbank actually goes a little further back to the late Middle Ages, and Milbank suggests that one of the big culprits for our fractured discourse today is late medieval nominalism and voluntarism. Now, you should recognize those terms. In the very first class, when we talked about God and ethics and the Euthyphro dilemma, and when I mentioned nominalism and voluntarism, that certainly reflects Milbank's influence on me. So I'll acknowledge that. And it goes back to this idea that in Western Christendom, there are these late medieval theologians who are beginning to get away from earlier concepts of the real distinction between God and creation, and are starting to sort of see God as almost like another subject that could be studied logically like any other subject in the world, and who are also starting to see ethics really in terms of God's arbitrary command. And that, Milbank says, really begins to break apart the earlier traditions in the West that held us together, and then kind of feeds into the Enlightenment and is part of the root of the problem today. And so, both for MacIntyre and for Milbank, there's kind of a decline narrative or a fall narrative. And I don't think either of them would say that there was a golden age before that decline and fall, but that there are ways of thinking ways of living and being before that decline and fall, which they both, identify in different ways, that we could begin to recapture. And in recapturing it, recapture, of course, modify and develop for our own circumstances, but part of the remedy is going back. Now, both of those narratives are controversial. Milbank's is particularly controversial in many ways. In some academic theology circles, I suppose they're almost fighting words, believe it or not. And it is questionable. There's been a lot written and discussed about the late medieval nominalists and voluntarists. The text mentions John Duns Scotus, and that is certainly a big foil for Milbank. And there's lots of questions about what did Scotus actually mean. Did Scotus really think of God in the way that folks like Milbank say he did, or was he using that as a kind of example or a form of reasoning? What influence did thinkers like Scotus really have? This also leads into big debates about the Reformation. Folks like Milbank will say that, on the whole, are not very positive about the Reformation, certainly not about its intellectual fruits. As we've seen a little bit already, thinkers like Luther and Calvin certainly were influenced by nominalism and voluntarism, and I don't think there's much debate about that. There's at least some influence there. We'll see some other texts that we'll read of Luther's throughout the semester, and I think you'll see some of that. So, there's some truth to that. How much truth, where that goes, big debates about that. We can't resolve it, and I won't even try to resolve it. I do really appreciate Milbank. I think there are ways in which the narrative is a little too simple, perhaps, but it's another important piece of it. Now, MacIntyre is looking at the Aristotelian tradition, and as we even looked at that just a little bit, right, it is really fundamentally a Greek hero culture. And Aristotle had these different categories of people in society, and the philosopher king and the warrior are important, valued parts of that society. So MacIntyre is going to fall on that end. Milbank picking up from that, and then also looking back in the Christian tradition and in particular, Milbank is very influenced by Augustine, and Augustine, of course, developed the just war tradition. So, Milbank is not going to be a pacifist. Now, Milbank does write quite a bit about, and he uses this phrase, the ontology of peace. So he is ultimately focused on the fact that the kingdom of God is a peaceable kingdom. But, Milbank is not going to say that Milbank would say there might be circumstances in which using force and using military force is necessary. And Milbank, in fact, he set off a firestorm a few years ago, writing about, he's in England. He's writing about some of the trouble with unemployment and drugs and other issues among British youth, and he suggested every British young man out of high school should spend a few years in a military academy. And that set off a firestorm with other ecclesial ethicists. All right, so you can kind of see that, but he's writing it again out of this sort of the virtue of service and so on. Now, the next figure on the screen is Stanley Hauerwas. So Hauerwas is one of the absolutely pivotal figures in ecclesial ethics in contemporary theology. Hauerwas is going to shy away a little bit from the narratives that MacIntyre and Milbank are putting forward. Now, it's not that Hauerwas denies entirely those narratives. He is going to recognize, I think as anybody must, that the Enlightenment is a big change, that ways of thinking about God and who God is and how God relates to creation significantly changed. Hauerwas certainly is not going to be friendly toward nominalism and voluntarism and so on. But he's going to shy away from that a little because he's going to see those kinds of narratives as really themselves a little bit imperialistic or a little bit too neat. And really themselves as kind of putting us a little bit too much in a particular box. He is, however, going to focus on the notion that, and this is a phrase of Hauerwas, the church should be the church. Now, I think one of the really interesting differences between MacIntyre, Milbank, and Hauerwas, MacIntyre is originally Scottish, I think, and then comes to the U.S., and he's writing, solidly in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Milbank is British through and through, high Anglican, Anglo-Catholic. Very, very. He considers himself a Catholic, really, but he's Anglican, and everything he's writing is from a real British perspective. His most recent book even refers to the original problem of the 13 colonies in the United States, a real British perspective. Right? And Hauerwas is American through and through, and Hauerwas is writing about the American experience, and he's writing about the white Protestant establishment. He's also writing to a certain degree about the evangelical establishment and how those establishments aligned themselves with certain kinds of American politics. And he's going to be very critical of those alignments. And one of those things that he's really critical about is that the white liberal Protestant establishment, the mainline establishment, and the evangelical establishment uncritically, historically uncritically accepted American wars and supported American wars and didn't resist American wars. Now, there's a certain thread there that goes back to the Vietnam era that, you and I are not really living through and didn't really live through. At least most of you, my students who I'm speaking to now, wouldn't really have lived through as an adult that era. I didn't. I was just an infant. But there were in church circles and theological circles certain kinds of tensions, and some Christians who really became cognizant of ideas about nonviolence during that time. But really, the establishments of all of the mainline churches and the evangelical churches and the Catholic Church as well, the Roman Catholic Church as well, maybe to, I don't want to say a lesser extent, but maybe to a more nuanced extent, supported that war and supported other wars. Although you see some voices in the Catholic Church that didn't. In any event, so this theme of nonviolence and the complicity of American Christianity in violence is really important for Hauerwas. And so Hauerwas is going to say, that that pacifism is in fact a really important feature of Christian ethics, and that is I think an interesting dynamic and tension among these different thinkers. They're all going to focus on those first two boxes, tradition and narratives. They're all going to focus, although, as we said, kind of in different ways, developing what the narrative is. They're all going to focus on virtue, habits, character. They're all writing about those things. How that all plays out in some of the issues that, specific issues that we'll look at through the semester, and in particular in war and in the state, the church's relation to the state is going to really vary. And I think that's an interesting dynamic. And there's one other figure. I don't have his picture here on this slide, but we did look at one of his a short excerpt from one of his works, the very first day of class, which is Oliver O'Donovan. And O'Donovan is mentioned in this chapter on ecclesial ethics as kind of a bridge figure in ecclesial ethics, and I think that's a really good description. I very, very much appreciate O'Donovan. I've read all of his ethical works and much of his political theology works. He does, in many ways, he certainly draws on the idea of tradition and narratives, although like Hauerwas, he's a little bit nervous about sort of the broad meta-narrative of someone like Milbank or even MacIntyre. He does focus on virtue and habits and character. But his focus on that, as the text mentioned, is a lot more eschatological than someone like Milbank or Hauerwas. And indeed, O'Donovan is specifically going to look to the resurrection. He's going to look to Christ's resurrection and then ultimately to the eschatological resurrection as the point at which, in fullness, the kingdom comes, and in which the fullness of the virtues can really be, are realized in Christ and really can be realized in us. I might almost say that Milbank and Hauerwas focus a bit more on the Eucharist in the present as kind of the location of the realization of ethics, and O'Donovan looks to the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection in the future as that location. Not that Milbank or Hauerwas minimize the resurrection, not that O'Donovan minimizes the Eucharist, but just a little bit of a difference in emphasis. And O'Donovan, has written a lot about just war theory and is not a pacifist, but neither is he as much a sort of someone tied to what I might call British concepts of politics, perhaps, as Milbank is. So again, O'Donovan is an interesting character that inhabits some of these places. Now, one other thing I just want to mention about each of these figures that we've talked about in ecclesial ethics. So some of their influences, we mentioned, MacIntyre looking to the Catholic intellectual tradition, Catholic social teaching, looking to, back in the classical tradition to Aristotle. Now, Milbank and Hauerwas are going to do that as well as O'Donovan. Milbank, I would suggest, is going to focus a lot more on Augustine in particular, and is going to focus a lot more on Plato and Platonism and Augustinian Platonism in particular. And in terms of Catholic thought, Milbank is also going to focus on a group of theologians who are called the ressourcement theologians. Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar, figures like that. Why is that? What were all those figures doing? They were all looking back to the Church Fathers and to the Church Fathers fusing or developing of Greek thought, particularly Plato's thought, in early Christianity. And that all of that is connected to something called the Cambridge movement, which is a much earlier movement. Milbank was originally a Cambridge person in Anglican thought. So there's some of that legacy, and I think you're going to find a lot of that in Milbank. Hauerwas and O'Donovan are very much going to draw. They're going to look at those pieces too, but they're very much more going to draw on Karl Barth. So the text mentions that Hauerwas is a big figure in terms of developing Barth's thought in ethics, and O'Donovan as well. And we could probably put a picture of Barth up here. We again looked at a piece of one of Barth's texts in the very first class. And Barth, too, is one of these key figures for our thinking about ethics and ecclesial ethics today. And, what's that difference in emphasis? Well, Barth has this, his own sort of Protestant take on revelation, on what God is doing when he speaks through Scripture and through the proclamation of the church to us. And we looked at that a little bit in last week's lecture when we talked about Barth's divine command theory. So it's a bit more of a kind of an immediate sense of revelation and of how God speaks and of how we hear him. Whereas I think for someone like Milbank, and Milbank, engages with Barth as well, but for someone like Milbank or MacIntyre, even though they're within this group that we might call ecclesial ethics, they are looking to the broader tradition of Hellenistic and early Christian thought. So they have a little bit more of a sense, and this is partly reflects their own ecclesial location a little bit perhaps, of the development and stability of the tradition. So again, both sides, so to speak, I wouldn't call them sides, but both different emphases, the kind of classical emphasis and the Barthian emphasis, if we want to put it that way, are recognizing that the tradition develops, the tradition is dynamic, and the tradition is unique. You have to inhabit the tradition. You can't demonstrate this tradition through some kind of neutral, rational argument in the way that you might demonstrate 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can use those kinds of arguments to help support it, but you have to inhabit it. But they're really going to draw on different streams or pieces or emphases within that tradition, partly reflecting, I think, just their own backgrounds and who they are.